Clemency Kopo. The subject is physical science. We are going to look at the topic atoms, elements, molecules, and compounds. However, my focus is going to be on the atomic structure and the periodic table. Before we go into detail, I really want us to look at the objectives of the lesson for today. Our objectives for this lesson is that at the end of the lesson, learners are expected to state the relative charge, approximate relative mass and atomic mass of a proton, a neutron, and an electron, including the position within an atom. Our second objective is that at the end of this lesson, a learner is expected to define proton number, which is represented by capital Z, of an element as the number of protons in the nucleus of each atom of that specific element. And then our second last objective is that at the end of this lesson, a learner is expected to define Nucleon number, which is represented by capital A, or the mass number of an element as number of protons and neutrons. Together, this is called nucleons in the nucleus. And then lastly, our objective is that at the end of the lesson, learners are expected, or a learner is expected to use proton number and the simple structure of atoms to explain the basis of the periodic table. However, we are going to look at the first 20 elements. So we are going to have a bit of a restriction with regard to the elements of focus. I quickly want to go into detail. Let us look at the main lesson. First, let us look at the atomic structure and the periodic table. When one talks about atomic structure and the periodic table, there are three fundamental terms that we need to acquaint ourselves to be able to understand the whole topic on atomic structure and the periodic table. So basically what I'll do, I just want to look at the definitions of each of these three components of interest: atoms, elements, compounds. Those three, we quickly need to look at the definitions, just to give us a bit of clarity. By defining an atom is the smallest unit into which matter can be divided and still retain the characteristics, properties of an element. So basically it means every atom that exists is having an element. And then by looking at an element may be defined as a substance consisting of atoms which all have the same number of protons. And this is sometimes regarded as same atomic number. So elements, in other words, are chemically the simplest substances. Hence, they cannot be broken down into smaller parts. And then lastly, if we look at the definition of a compound we may define a compound as a substance consisting of atoms or ions of two or more different elements in a definite proportion joined by chemical bonds into a molecule. So in simple terms, it means if I have a molecule, if I have two or more atoms combining, or if I have element plus an element combined, but those elements distinctively, they must be from non-metals. So I quickly want us to give a bit of an overview of what we have just indicated in those definitions. So to begin with, if I have to look at the atom, some people may prefer to use the word atom instead of atom. So this atom, every atom that exists has what we call an element. And then an element plus an element will give us what we call a compound. And then lastly, out of this combination, a compound, remember what I indicated in our definition, that a compound is made out of two or more atoms combined chemically. It means if those atoms that are combined, they are from non-metals, they will give us another substance called a molecule. All right, we have an atom followed by an element, after a compound, and then a compound, a molecule comes in. So this sequence will allow us to contrast between those four terms. So what I want us to do is that if we say, for example, if I have an atom, I may consider a simple atom like sodium. If I have a sodium atom, it means that sodium atom has an element called sodium element. But however, for us to have a compound, it means I may join two atoms to give us that compound. So basically it means if, for example, you consider an element in group 1, just for simplicity sake, if I have sodium Na plus an element, say, in group 7, say chlorine. So sodium plus chlorine will give us sodium chloride. This compound, sodium chloride, is what we consider to be a mixture of one atom of sodium combining with one atom of chlorine. So by mixture, you should get me very well on this one. It means this is ionic bonding. Hence, one electron in the last shell of sodium will be transferred to the last shell of chlorine, which is having 7. So if we were to look at the electron configuration, here we will realize that sodium is having 2, 8, 1. So by this we are saying sodium atom is having 2 electrons in the first shell, followed by 8 electrons in the next shell, and then the last shell accommodates 1 electron. Therefore, if we talk about ionic bonding, though this is a topic on its own, but if I can touch on that one just to give a bit of clarity with regard to the sodium chloride, it means 1 electron in the last shell of sodium is going to be transferred to the chlorine atom. So the electron configuration of chlorine is 2, 8. The first shell accommodates 2, the next shell will accommodate 8, and then the last one is going to accommodate 7. So when we are talking about transfer of the electron, because this 1 in the last shell will be transferred to the last shell of chlorine. So in other words, sodium will have 2, 8, and then chlorine is going to have 2, 8, 8. So that compound, sodium chloride, is a mixture of 2 atoms of sodium and chlorine. So the word compound, as I've indicated in my initial definition, is when you have 2 or more atoms combining. Because these atoms, remember, could be from non-metals or they could be from metals. We may also contrast between a compound and a molecule. So in this regard, let me use a different example. I'll use a reaction between 2 atoms of hydrogen. So considering hydrogen, we can write H plus another H. So this yields H2. All right, so to be able to understand the concept of a molecule, here we can say hydrogen, remember, is in group 1. So hydrogen has 1 electron in the last shell. So basically it means the electronic configuration is just going to be 1, implying that the last shell only accommodates 1 electron. So if I have this 1 electron plus another electron which is in the last shell, so this will give us 2 atoms of hydrogen combining. Hence, those electrons that are in the last shell will combine to give us a molecule to stabilize. So basically, if we were to use the shells, it means I'll have hydrogen with 1 electron plus another hydrogen with that electron. So therefore, when the 2 combine, they will give us something that looks like this. All right, if we consider the structure of the atom, under this we are saying if we have an atom, this atom comprises of the central part, which is made out of the protons, and so out of these 3, It means if we talk of a neutral atom, we are looking at the positive and the negative charge of the atom, which will give us a 0, because summation of positive plus negative gives us a 0. So this is a neutral atom. When we are talking about the composition, one should take into account that we are looking at what makes the atom, because by default it means a proton is having a charge, a neutron is having a charge, equally the electron is also having a charge, which is negative. So from here we can now extend it to the concept of the periodic table, because we are going to incorporate the atom into the periodic table. Because remember what I said earlier, when we have the atom, the element, the compound, and the molecule, one cannot separate those entities. They are inclusively part of the chemistry. So therefore, we are going to look at the periodic table and then the relationship between the periodic table and the atom, or reversibly the atom and the periodic table, because there is a relationship between those terms, atom and the periodic table. So we shall quickly look at the periodic table, because the periodic table, before we end the lesson, I quickly want us to look at the summary of what we have done in this lesson. We earlier looked at the 4 terms: atom, element, compound, molecule. So this is where I gave a definition of each of those terms. And then this was followed by considering sodium and chlorine as an example to demonstrate what happens for one to be able to achieve a compound, or for one to form a compound. So I gave an example of sodium and chlorine where we spoke about the transfer of an electron. There's a topic on covalent and ionic bond. However, for now we are just looking at the mere example on how atoms are combining to generate a compound or a molecule. So we also looked at hydrogen, where we covered the concept of having 2 atoms of hydrogen combining to give us H2, whereby lastly we looked at the concept of the composition of the atom. So we basically looked at what makes an atom. And then finally I went on to look at the charges. Proton is having a positive, the neutron 0, and then the electron a negative. Thank you for watching. Until next time.